What I want to do is sort of tell you just one story. It's a little protracted story, but it's a story I want you to kind of keep your eye on it and kind of identify the issues, as they arise. What kind of issues that you would identify as a lawyer, that you'd segregate out to think in terms of addressing them in some way, and try to understand what kind of impact the resolution of those particular issues would have on the overall mission that you're engaged in. And it was this, that back in February of 1984, this is after Ronald Reagan and George Bush had been elected in 1980, in November of 1980, unseating President Carter. And Reagan and Bush came into office in January 21st of 1981. And they had issued, actually it was Bush issued it under the name of Reagan, issued an executive order ordering the MIGRA, the immigration police, in the Brownsville, Texas Immigration and Naturalization Service to refuse any applications for political refugee status from Guatemala or El Salvador. That he thought that would look bad if the United States were granting political asylum status to people coming from there, because he'd had the presidents and the head of the military of both El Salvador and Guatemala at his inauguration. And so he issued this order. So they were arresting people. When people would come to the Immigration and Naturalization Service along the border in Brownsville, Texas, and apply for political asylum, they'd immediately be arrested and taken away and put in this big stockade and held there. And then the officials would contact the military in the country, El Salvador or Guatemala, and let them know the exact plane and flight they were going to be coming back in on. And then they'd put them on a plane and send them back home. And they were all just disappearing. And so the Catholic priest, the bishop, John Fitzpatrick, who was the bishop of southern Texas, set up a thing called Casa Romero, and was having people who were seeking political asylum come to Casa Romero, and then he would actually assist in having them transported away from the Brownsville INS office all the way up to San Antonio so they could apply for political asylum there. And it turns out that on the night of February 17th of 1984, Sister Diane Mellencamp and Stacy Lynn Merck, a Catholic volunteer, and a reporter from the Dallas Times-Herald, Jack Fisher, were all driving two Salvadorian refugees up from the border at Brownsville up to San Antonio, and they got stopped by the MIGRA and arrested, and all charged with illegal transportation of undocumented Central American aliens. So I got a call on Sunday morning on the 19th. They were arrested on the night, Friday night on the 17th. I got a call Sunday morning from Philip Wheaton, who was an Episcopal priest who was on the board of directors of the American Sanctuary Movement. And he called and said that Bishop Fitzpatrick had called and asked if the legal counsel from the Jesuit National Headquarters could come in and defend the people that had all been arrested. So we jumped on a plane and flew down there. Father Wally Kozabowski and myself flew down, and we went into the arraignment and got them released on their own recognizance into the custody of Bishop Fitzpatrick. And we were staying, Father Kozabowski and I were staying at the Vicar General's house there in Brownsville. And while we were going through some of the preliminary hearings, the Bishop Fitzpatrick came over to the Vicar General's house and said that the bishop of the Methodist Church in Brownsville wanted to meet with me, and he was going to come over to the Vicar General's house for us to have this meeting. So he came over and we sat down to have the meeting, and he said that he had been approached by one of his people in his congregation, and warned not to have anything to do with the American Sanctuary Movement, which Bishop Fitzpatrick was trying to talk the Methodist bishop into opening up his church to be a sanctuary, along with the Catholic Church there in Brownsville. And the member of the congregation came out of the audience and talked to the Methodist bishop and said, you can't have anything to do with the American Sanctuary Movement because they're smuggling known communist terrorists into the United States. And in the event that President Reagan or Vice President Bush decide that they might want to, for example, send the U.S. military into El Salvador or Guatemala, or potentially Nicaragua, that these 500,000 undocumented Central American aliens that are in the United States might be going to organize themselves into military cadres and attack our military bases and our electric stations, our electric transistors, and poison our reservoirs. And they went on this litany of all these things that they might be going to do. Well, I sort of laughed out loud. We set up the meeting, and he started telling me all this, right? And it turns out when he told Bishop Fitzpatrick that, Bishop Fitzpatrick said to him, ironically, we have the legal counsel for the Jesuits here, actually here, staying here, working on this case where the people have been arrested. And, if anything like that were going on, at least the Jesuits would know. So he said, look, why don't we have a meeting? So we sat down to have the meeting. And when he explained this, I just kind of laughed right out loud about how preposterous that was. Because, in fact, if it had been going on, we would have known about it. And so I said, but what we'll do is I'll put some investigators on this, and we'll get to the bottom of where this kind of a false rumor might be coming from. And so we did. And I got a hold of William Johnstone Taylor, who was my chief investigator when I was an attorney at F. Lee Bailey's office. We had an entire firm of 40 Class A licensed gun toter investigators that worked with us full time at our law office. And Bill Taylor was assigned to me. He was a co-founder of the Federal Association of Former Federal Investigators and the founder of the Florida Association of Professional Investigators, and a 3-tour Vietnam Marine Corps CID, Criminal Investigation Division. And so I called him, and I called Howard Rosenberg, who was the chief researcher for Dan Rather at CBS Evening News, Howard Cohn, who was the editor-in-chief of the Rolling Stone magazine in Washington, D.C., and Bob Fink, who was the chief investigator for Congresswoman Bela Abzug, who chaired the House Judiciary Committee subcommittee on individual rights. And so I asked them all to start looking to find out where this rumor was coming from, that somehow there were known communist terrorists that were supposed to be being smuggled across the border by the American Sanctuary Movement. And I got a call from Bill Taylor. We were right in the midst of the trial, doing the trial to get all the charges dismissed, which there eventually were, against Sister Mellencamp and Jack Fisher and Stacy Lynn Merck. But when we were in the midst of the trial, I get a call from Bill Taylor, and he said, look, we can't talk about this on the phone, but you got to come down here to Florida right away and meet with me, because we've gotten at where this rumor is coming from. So I fly down there after the trial was over. I go down, and he said that, look, a friend of his who was a friend of his in Vietnam, in the military, in the Army, U.S. Army CID, was the head of the National Guard, State National Guard in Louisiana. And he called me when I put out the word. I was trying to figure out where this rumor was coming from. And so he called me and said that I went and met with him, and he said, look, what's going on here is there's a major military readiness exercise that's been called by Vice President George Bush Sr. This is 1984. This is in March of 1984. He said there's been a major military readiness exercise called Rex 84, Readiness Exercise 1984. And they were going to be rehearsing airlifting the 82nd Airborne out of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, under the color of darkness, down into El Salvador or Guatemala or Nicaragua, if they found it to be necessary. And they were going to do it in the nighttime. And so the whole thing was codenamed as Operation Night Train. He said, but what had happened is that the head of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, that had been created by President Carter in the previous administration to deal with hurricanes and earthquakes and floods and things like this. The person who'd been appointed by the Reagan-Bush administration to head up FEMA, a fellow named Louis Giuffreda, was brought in, and he had been the commandant of the California Special Organized Crime Training Institute down in San Luis Obispo, where they have all these guys in ninja clothes jumping out of trees on each other and, attacking each other like Odd Job or something in the Pink Panther. Anyway, he said that this guy had gotten all freaked out when he heard about the readiness exercise, because he said, what about these 500,000 undocumented Central American aliens that are here in the United States? What happens if President Reagan and Vice President Bush fly the 82nd Airborne into El Salvador, and all these 500,000 undocumented Central American aliens decide they're going to form military cadres and attack our military bases and our police stations and our electric generators and poison our reservoir? And this is where it all came from. And so this guy says this readiness exercise was going on, and Louis Giuffreda wanted to rehearse, while they were rehearsing airlifting the 82nd Airborne down into El Salvador, they wanted to rehearse rounding up all 500,000 of the undocumented Central American aliens and putting them in 10 military detention camps that they would put on military bases. And as long as he was going to be doing that rehearsal, he wanted to get a hold of the ADEX list, which is the administrative index, which is kept by the Attorney General of the United States of American citizens, whom they believe, in the event the president finds it necessary to declare a state of national emergency, might constitute a threat to the national security of the United States. And so he wanted to have that list. And so he went to William French Smith, who was the Attorney General in the first administration of the Reagan-Bush administration, because Ed Meese, who became the Attorney General in the second term, was the Chief of Staff at that time. And so that Louis Giuffreda went to William French Smith and demanded to be given a copy of the ADEX list of these American citizens. And William French Smith wouldn't give it to him. So Louis Giuffreda went to Ed Meese, who was the Chief of Staff, and demanded that he order William French Smith to give him this list of American citizens with their addresses and where they could be found. And Meese went and ordered William French Smith to give it over to him, and he refused. So they went directly to Reagan and got Reagan to order him to do it. And William French Smith refused. Absolutely. He said, I will not do that. He said, and not only that, but I won't resign. And if you fire me, I'll go to the media and tell them what you wanted to do. And so they didn't give it to Louis Giuffreda. And so that whole thing was going down. And so he was going to go forth and practice rounding up these 500,000 undocumented Central American aliens. But there's a federal statute called the Posse Comitatus Act, which prohibits the deployment of U.S. military forces stateside to enforce the law. And so what they did is they had to try to figure out how to recruit civilians to volunteer to work for Louis Giuffreda and the Federal Emergency Management Agency to go around helping to practice rounding up these 500,000 undocumented Central American aliens and interring them at these 10 military detention facilities on these military bases. And what happened, and this is the head of the Louisiana State National Guard is telling my investigator, Bill Taylor, what happened is they recruited private civilians to join these things called state defense forces. And they got several of the southern states to pass a statute, the legislature establishing a state defense force of civilians who were private volunteers. And then what they would do is here in Louisiana, they were going to participate in this readiness exercise. And so we received, the State National Guard received a whole shipment of weapons from the Pentagon. M16s, 45 pistols, submachine guns, grenades, other things like this. And we were ordered to distribute them to these state defense forces. And it turns out the state defense forces had been recruited through Soldier of Fortune magazine, Robert K. Brown's magazine, where they have all these wannabes that run around in the forest, shooting paintballs at each other, or paintball guns and stuff. And this is what the crowd that they'd recruited to be the state defense forces for the state of Louisiana. So the State National Guard had been instructed to provide all the weapons to them for this readiness exercise, for rehearsing, rounding up all these undocumented Central American aliens. But they were ordered at the end of the readiness exercise to revalue all of those weapons from their original distribution value to their much higher replacement value. And then they were only supposed to gather up the same dollar amount of weapons at the end of the readiness exercise, leaving approximately half of all these weapons out in the hands of these right-wing yahoos. So my investigator, Bill Taylor, said to his friend, the head of the National Guard, he says, "What the hell is this? Some kind of 7 days in May scenario?" Which you guys probably don't know what that means. There's a book called 7 Days in May, and it's a movie which you should see in respect for Kirk Douglas, who has just died. He and Burt Lancaster starred in this movie called 7 Days in May. That's an assignment. I see you writing furiously here. Anyway, you ought to watch 7 Days in May. You can get it on Netflix or anything. Okay, so he said, "What the hell is this? Some kind of 7 Days in May scenario?" And the guy said, No. They're going to smuggle all those weapons to the Contras. Because it turns out that from the time I got contacted on the morning of February 19th of 1984, in March of 1984, the next month, the United States Congress had passed a statute prohibiting the Reagan-Bush administration from providing any aid, direct or indirect, to the Contras, who were the former military officers for Anastasio Somoza, who was the right-wing fascist dictator in Nicaragua, who had been ousted by the Sandinista. And so they were in exile, and they had branded themselves the Contras, and they got caught mining the harbors, the international harbors in Nicaragua, in violation of international law, and the International Court of Justice had declared them to be international criminals. So the United States Congress had gotten up on its hind legs and passed a statute prohibiting the Reagan-Bush administration from giving any aid, direct or indirect, to the Contras. So they had devised this entire strategy of having private civilians volunteer to be the state defense forces and be given weapons through this readiness exercise. And then at the end of the exercise, they set up a bookkeeping mechanism by means of which they'd be allowed to keep half of the weapons, which they were going to smuggle to the Contras. So because of our doing the case on behalf of the American Sanctuary Movement, we had walked right on top of this major scheme to smuggle weapons to the Contras in violation of the flat-out act of Congress. So after winning that case, we started doing an investigation to figure out how we would go about dealing with these people, how we could get standing to bring a cause of action against them, what kind of cause of action we would bring, what the charges would be that would give us standing to engage in a full-scale investigation against them and get depositions, etc. Okay, so I'll go around the room now and ask each one of you. No, I'm not going to do that. a little paralysis set in there. These are a lot more interesting situations than, if somebody falls off a porch and breaks their leg, can you tell us what the tort claims are going to be, against the person who owns the house, person who rented the house, the rent, all that stuff. But so these are the scale of things that you guys should be thinking about. If you're in the ACLU club, or the American Constitution Society, which, by the way, Larry Tribe started. Most people don't know that. But Larry Tribe was the one who actually initiated that, and he had one of his students, who was a professor at Georgetown, actually do the face work on that. So that what I want you to do is, what we want to talk about for the rest of the time we have here is, what are you going to be able to do in light of this bizarre situation that we're faced with here, where we have a flagrant constitutional criminal, in the White House, which was similar to what we encountered not only with Richard Nixon, but also George Bush Sr., who was a flagrant criminal, and also Vice President Cheney, who's also a criminal constitutionally, and knows it and doesn't care. And so we've had a series of these people in the administrations, and so the question is going to be, obviously you're going to be in one of two different universes, a year from now. If there's any reasonable chance that Donald Trump is going to get elected again, you guys are going to have to figure out how to be consiglieri, regular wartime attorneys, to be in the field dealing with the things that will need to be done under those circumstances, and going in front of courts which are, inveterately hostile to any kind of constitutional claims at all. But if, in fact, Bernie and Liz win, if we're successful, those of us who are going to be delegates going to Milwaukee in July, if we're successful in getting Bernie and Elizabeth Warren to join together and become the nominees, and you get enough of your friends to register to vote, it's going to be completely determined by the people basically under 35 years old. If the people under 35 register to vote and actually get out to vote and stuff like that, that I think what will happen is that Bernie Sanders will be the president for one full term. Elizabeth will be his vice president. She'll come then on to have two full terms. There'll be 12 years that we'll have an administration that some of you will probably go to work for, when you get out of here, into the Justice Department, the Civil Rights Division, other branches of the government. And they're going to bring in a lot of the other candidates, that obviously, Kamala Harris would be the Attorney General, who will kick the crap out of Trump after he's out of office, and she'll prosecute him till the cows come home. And Inslee would be the head of the Environmental Protection Agency. You have others that are candidates that would be part of an administration, and we're working at trying to get Bernie and Liz to agree to name a cabinet in their campaign if they secure the nomination together. To name their cabinet, so that they can campaign as a government in waiting, basically. So that's a different universe. It's the universe that we hope that as lawyers you will do everything in your power to bring about, because it's an entirely different constitutional order that we're going to be addressing in that time. It's going to take some time to undo the ravages of what's happened, in a 4-year period with Trump. But a substantial amount of the damage that's being done has been done through executive action, as you know. The revocation of executive orders that were put in by Obama, the disregard of enforcing certain laws that are designed to protect the environment, et cetera. So during the first 2 years or so of the Bernie Sanders administration, of the 4 years, there's going to be an awful lot of work that has to get done administratively, kind of undoing the rules and regulations that have been set up by the Trump administration. But then there's going to be a longer period of constructive work that's going to get done. There are going to be judicial appointments that have to be made. There's going to have to be work done at the law schools to train up the upcoming cadre of young lawyers and stuff like that are going to be able to move forward and deal with things such as global climate change. I mean, the global climate change thing is going to be a huge thing that's got to get done. And a lot of you who are interested in civil rights work, et cetera, are going to have to come to grips with the national security state measures that are being rolled into place right now by the United States military to start preparing for the inevitable consequences of global climate change already. You know, the massive immigration is going to be taking place out of areas of the world where the desertification is going to be setting in a major way. The rising sea levels along the sea coasts. You know, there are of the 403 private nuclear reactors that are in the world, over 150 of them are all within 1 mile of the oceans around the world because they've been using the salt water to cool the reactor cores, just like at Fukushima. You know, and they don't know what to do about that. I mean, with the rising sea levels inundating those nuclear plants, you know, they're gonna go the same way that Fukushima did. You know, they're gonna melt down and go crazy, and they still haven't developed anything what to do other than keep pumping more water through that facility and having all the radioactive water pour into the ocean right now. And it's going to take lawyering, a lot of very aggressive, forward-leaning lawyering, not just in courts. I imagine you know by this time that probably only approximately 10% of law school graduates actually go to court. You know, I mean, the vast bulk of the lawyers work on drafting contracts, going to government agencies, doing regulations, do all kinds of negotiations, help run businesses, do all kinds of things. But it's the television and movies deal with a lot of the trials and stuff like that. But there's going to be tons of work that need to get done by forward-leaning, progressive lawyers such as yourself. And so I wanted to be able to come and talk with you about how we perceive this. One of the things that you'll note about even a presentation, the short presentation like I'm making to you now, is that you can't be chicken shit about talking about things that are true. People go, ooh, you can't name an actual candidate. You can't take a position with regard to a fucking criminal in the White House. You know, oh, you can't do that. You know, somebody's going to piss their pants and you're going to be really in trouble, you know, and somebody's going to throw a fit, you know. The reality is you got to step forward. You got to step forward. You got to have the courage to tell the truth. You got to work hard and not be afraid of the fact that people are going to disagree with you. You know, I mean, if there's one thing that's been made clear over the last 3 or 4 years is that there's always going to be somebody that disagrees with you. I mean, they may be just completely ignorant, but they can be very vociferous, and some people can be in positions of power, and they'll disagree with you. But you can't be deterred by that. You know, you can be more civil than I tend to be. You know, that you can be friendly. You can be buddies with people, even if you don't agree with them. You know, it doesn't take people very long to know that I disagree with them on something, and I don't figure I'm being friends with them when we get done. And I haven't been. You know, so but you'll be known. You know, when it comes time for you to pass over and leave the world, you'll be known by the people that are friends of yours and the people who are adversaries. You know, so don't be afraid of the fact that you're going to have adversaries, and there are going to be people who take it personally, and that they're going to, you know, look into every single thing you do and say, and try to figure out what they can use to criticize you about. So don't be worried about that. You know, that I've spent a lot of time being criticized by, you know, like Jack Singlaub, General Jack Singlaub, who's the president of the World Anti-Communist League. You know, he's taken great umbrage at things that we've done to him in the past. And then we got Ollie North. Actually, Ollie North and I get along very well. Ollie North and I were kind of pals, you know, because he knew that what he was doing was illegal, and he knew somebody was coming after him, and he ended up finding out that it was me. But there are other people who you're never going to be able to be friends with, like Theodore Shaklee, who you don't even know who he is. That Theodore G Shaklee was the ADDO, the Associate Deputy Director for Operations for the Central Intelligence Agency under George Bush Sr. when he was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency from 1975 to 1977. And Theodore Shaklee ran his covert operations worldwide for the Central Intelligence Agency. And he has an extraordinary background that he was the protege to General Reinhard Gehlen. General Reinhard Gehlen was the commander of the Waffen SS Third Reich anti-Soviet and anti-Eastern intelligence. And he, at the end of World War II, was made the head of West German intelligence by the American OSS. And he served for 26 years as the principal source of intelligence against the Soviet Union, and ended up being primarily responsible for poisoning the well between the former allies of Russia and the United States. And Theodore Shaklee also, after spending 26 years in that position as the deputy to Reinhard Gehlen, basically, ended up being made the chief of station in Miami, helping to supervise all of the covert operations against Cuba, the burning of their sugar fields and blowing up of bridges and all that stuff that the rabidly anti-communist right-wing Cuban fascista, from Miami were engaged in. Then he became the CIA station chief in Laos, where he entered into the major agreement with Bang Pao, one of the three major opium warlords, to be involved in shipping opium around the world and skimming money off of it to fund the Phoenix program, which was a massive political assassination program that killed at least 20,000 non-combatant civilians throughout Southeast Asia. And then was elevated to being the head of Western Hemisphere operations for the CIA, supervising the overthrowing of Allende in Chile, the murdering of their ambassador, Allende here in Washington, D.C., helping to supervise and instigate the overthrow of the democratic government in Argentina by the colonels, and then was rewarded for all of this by being handpicked by George Bush Sr., to be the director of covert operations worldwide for the CIA under George Bush. So there's a world out there. There's a world out there that you're going to have to get familiar with if you really want to do your job. And I mean, you could do chintzy little stuff if you want. With your degree, you can go to work for Pig and a Poke, law firm somewhere. You could even, work for a local chapter of ACLU and, beat up on police who engage in brutality and discrimination, all of which is not unimportant. But there's some very, very, very major things going on in the world that it would behoove you to become familiar with. We may be teaching a course here in the fall that we're talking with the dean right now. They have this whole requirement for experiential learning, but that it's not a clinic. It's not technically a clinic where you actually take clients and do work, but it's an experiential course of, talking and dialoguing about real events that are going on in the world, figuring out what you might do about it, how you could set up your own practice to actually practice constitutional law that we've been very successful in doing over the last 50 years. I've set up various 501c3s. I did all the trials for ACLU for 10 states for a period of time. I was legal counsel for the ACLU, co-counsel, did the amicus briefs in the Wounded Knee occupation cases for the Lakota Sioux back in '73. Was legal counsel in the Watergate burglary cases. We did our office represented James McCord, who was the CIA wiretapping specialist there that blew the whistle, wrote the letter to Judge Sirica blowing the whistle on the plumbers in Nixon. That you're only going to have as interesting a kind of work as you insist upon. But the fact is, if you insist upon doing important things and doing important cases, you need to be able to be creative to figure out how to discern what the major issues are that are available for you in your life, how you get to help on those things. You can volunteer to be, an assistant counsel on cases where, you don't have to get paid for it. You just want to be there to get the experience, to get the contact with the people that are doing it. And hopefully, if it works out that we teach this course starting in the fall, that's the kind of thing we're going to be working on, is trying to figure out how to think about how it is that you can step out into the world coming right up out of law school. I ended up initiating the case that established the right of journalists to protect our confidential news sources, as a second-year law student. Okay, and I ended up doing the Watergate burglary case and stuff like this. Represented the New York Times in the Pentagon Papers case, and all of this before I was 30 years old. So you need to understand that you can do these things, but you've got to want to do these things. You're going to be blessed coming out of law school with this extraordinary situation in the country that is almost unprecedented. It's precedented to some extent by the Civil War, and it's precedented to some extent by the McCarthy era. When everybody who read more than 2 books a year was getting, fired and thrown into jail for refusing to testify against all their friends that also read books. So there have been periods in our history, the robber baron era, 1868 to 1898 with McKinley and Mark Hanna coming to power. This is not unprecedented, but you're actually the beneficiaries of a world that's extraordinarily interesting for lawyers, for constitutional lawyers, for progressive, constitutionally minded lawyers. You're in this absolute nirvana, coming out into the world for practicing law. But you have to think about it. You have to be serious about it. You have to be willing to have people dislike you. You have to be willing to be controversial. But you also should take the course in the fall. If it comes through that we're going to do that in the fall. How many of you are going to still be here in the fall? You're not graduating? Okay, all right. So the other guys have to audit it. You can come and audit the course afterwards. Yeah. So anyway, that's my opening statement. But there's lots of questions I think that you probably have about it, and we've got until 10 o'clock tonight. You probably have some homework you have to do, some cases you have to prepare for the morning. But look, any questions that you've got, I'd be happy to answer them. And go ahead.
My first thought was just, what is your opinion of Bill Barr as the AG right now?
Bill Barr's a fucking criminal. He ought to be fucking in prison, is what my opinion of it is.
Should he been in prison for Iran-Contra?
Yeah, he did the same thing. He was the Attorney General for Bush Sr., who directed Bush Sr. to pardon all the first 6 people that we got indicted. We got the Special Prosecutor Lawrence Walsh indicted 6 of them, clearly planning to lever them up, to get them convicted, get sentences imposed upon them, and then negotiate with them for relieving some of their sentences to actually roll over and start testifying about other people, like George Bush Sr. Because George Bush Sr.'s national security advisor, vice presidential national security advisor, Donald P. Gregg, was actually the CIA case officer for Rafael Chichi Quintero and also for Felix Rodriguez, who were running the Ilopango airlift operation. Just to state a fact. And the fact is, Barr knew it, and Barr knew that his client, George Bush Sr., was a criminal and should have been in prison for what he was doing. And he said, "Look, what you want to do is exercise your pardoning power as the president to pardon those first 6 guys, so they can't testify against you." And that's exactly what he did. And he's going to do it again. He's going to advise Trump to do that, to pardon Roger Stone, to pardon Manafort, anybody who can really roll over on him and get him convicted, and he's a constitutional criminal. Just to do it briefly.
I got a couple of ones that should be a short answer. The first is Casa Romero an influence for the Romero Institute?
No, it's the same guy.
Okay.
It was Bishop Oscar Romero, the same guy they're named after. But actually, our original 501c3 was the Christic Institute, named after a term of art developed by Teilhard de Chardin, who was the Jesuit priest who was a paleontologist who discovered Peking man, who was actually trying to explain how Christ and Lao Tzu and Confucius and the Buddha and others are in fact a biological mutation that actually display a faculty which is evolving teleologically in our human family over time, but it was full blown as a mutation, that they had this faculty of discernment, of being able to experientially encounter the unitive phenomenon that bonds every unit in the universe into harmony, and that they could therefore make a judgment about what was harmonious or disharmonious to the natural order of things, and they were elucidating that. And that's what they call the Christic force. And so our original 501c3 was the Christic Institute, but George Bush, on the same day, actually December 25th of 1992, on which he pardoned the first 6 defendants, issued the order yanking our 501c3 tax-exempt charter on the grounds that we were engaged in political activity, because nobody had been ultimately imprisoned for anything we accused them of, and so therefore it must have been motivated by political motive. And as a 501c3, you're not allowed to engage in political activity. So the Romero Foundation out in California heard about that, the revocation of our C3, and so they immediately held an emergency meeting and elected me their president, and Sarah Nelson, our vice president, their vice president, and Father Bill Davis, their secretary treasurer, and their entire board resigned. And so we became the Romero Institute. That's what we function as now.
Interesting. Okay. So the second question is a little more substantive, and I wanted to ask Chemerinsky about this, but I didn't get a chance, because his progressive vision is like 5 things that are very clear cut, and he makes this argument that we need to sell them to the broader public. Well, there's a fundamental problem with selling stuff to the broader public on our side of the aisle. The conservatives have an excellent ecosystem to sell whatever bullshit they're selling, right? Mm-hmm. We don't have, not really at least, a way to make that sale to the broader public in the way that they do. So how do you deal with sort of like broadcast media, mass media, social media? How do we create the same effect they have without maybe, the sort of distortion of the truth that gets a little bit?
What you have to do is you have to do like we did. Is our law firm has also a public education division, has a grassroots organizing division, has a fundraising division, has a media division. Ergo, this stuff. What you need to do is you need to think in terms of what all the resources are that you need to have at your beck and call to be able to do the things you want to do, and then you start setting it up. In fact, I remember when at Harvard Law School, Ralph Nader came there one time, and I stood up in the audience and said to him, "Mr. Nader, how is it we can get to go and work for you?" And he said, "No, you don't want to come to work for me. You want to set up your own operation. That's what you want to do. You want to set up your own operation. You want to, bring in all your own friends and everybody that you can, and get people who have different kind of talents to do the things you want to do. And as I say, you need to have an investigation division. You want to learn how to use professional investigators, because that's something the public interest community doesn't really know much about, because they tend to be generally hostile toward military people and law enforcement people, and that's where the people get trained to be investigators. So you want to have a professional investigating group. You want to have a legal research group and a factual research group now, which you have access to the internet. You want to have a public media. You want to have a media operation. You want to be able to have Twitter. You want to have social accounts. You want to be able to do podcasts. You want to be able to do documentary films. You want to get access to dramatic scripted series, on episodes on television. You want to just go for it. And that's what you want to do. And the fact of the matter is we have the capacity now to be as aggressive and forward-leaning in doing public education as the CBS had, 50 years ago. You can get it right up in front of all kinds of people. All you have to do is get people to listen to you, okay? And so that's what you really need to do. It's one of the major things you need to do is be self-reliant. Don't think you just have to go to work for ACLU. They only hire a limited number of people, as you know. But set up your own operation and get after them. Now, so the question you have next is, who's the them, right? Well, I'll tell you a brief story. Right after we filed the Iran-Contra case on May 26th of 1986, Friday evening, we filed at 4:30 the complaint under the Federal Criminal Racketeering Act, civil provisions, and we filed it down in Miami in the Southern District of Florida. Bill Taylor filed it, and Monday morning at 10 o'clock, I get a call on the phone. And it's Judge James Lawrence King. And he says, hello, Mr. Sheehan. He said, this is James Lawrence King. I'm the Chief Federal Judge of the Southern District of Florida. I have your complaint in front of me here, filed Friday afternoon. He said, and because of the sensitivity of the issues in here, I've decided to take the case myself, which means he didn't put it on the wheel to have any judge just take it. He just took it himself. And he said, and I just wanted to let you know that unless you're in front of my court personally this afternoon by 2 o'clock, I'm going to enter a summary judgment against your complaint. And then he just hung up. So my response exactly. I said, what? And so I had a suit in the closet at the office, so I ran and jumped into my suit and ran and got a cab and went down to the National Airport. Flew down to Miami, jumped in a cab, went screeching over to the courthouse, go running upstairs, and I go to his chambers, and he's not there. He's out in the ceremonial courtroom, already all robed up and sitting there. So I go into the courtroom, and he's got 26 lawyers all sitting in the courtroom. And this is Monday afternoon, 2 o'clock, from the filing on Friday at 4:30 in the afternoon of the complaint. We got 26 lawyers sitting there. And he says, well, Mr. Sheehan, I'm glad to see that you made it. He said, I just wanted to introduce you to the lawyers that are going to be representing the people that you've named in your complaint. We have here who's going to be representing Mr. Adolfo Calero, whom you've alleged within the four corners of your complaint was the head of the FDN Contras. And this is going to be Mr. Anthony Lapham. And so I said, Anthony Lapham. I'm saying, why do I recognize it? And it dawned on me, Anthony Lapham was chief counsel for the Central Intelligence Agency under George Bush when he was the director of the CIA from 1975 to 1977. And so he's going to be chief counsel for Calero. He said, and representing Mr. Ronald Joseph Martin Jr., who's the head of the Tamiami gun shop here in Florida that you've alleged is the source of the false end user certificates on the weapons that you profess are being smuggled from here down to the Contras. He says, is Mr. Williams, and you may recognize his name as well because he was, in fact, the head of the criminal division of the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Miami until last Friday at 5 o'clock, at which point he retired, and he has decided to go into private practice. And he's going to be representing, he said, and I said, professional criminals, Your Honor, I think it's the term you're looking for. He said, okay, Mr. Sheehan, that's enough of that. He said, that's why I've really brought you down here. He said, I want to make it clear to you that I've placed this complaint under seal, and I'm imposing a gag order on you right now. And if you so much as breathe a word to an other living soul about the existence of this complaint, I'm going to put you in federal prison for 6 months for direct criminal contempt of this court. And I just wanted to make sure that there was no question about that. And I said, well, I don't have any question about the fact that you've done it. I said, but I don't have the slightest interest in paying attention to it. I said, that's completely unconstitutional. You don't have any right at all. And he said, well, you may not be familiar with the federal rules of civil procedure here in the Southern District of Florida. And I said, well, actually, I think they're probably the same ones that apply everywhere else. I said, in fact, Professor Shapiro is the one who wrote them, and I worked on them with him. At Harvard Law School, my entire class in civil procedure helped write these things. And he said, and I said, I know there's a provision in there that authorizes a federal judge to have some degree of discretion in imposing certain reasonable rules to protect a jury against being contaminated by public information. I said, but there's no way that this is within the ambit of, and he looked at me and he said, well, we have a provision here that grants discretion to a judge to actually impose regional restrictions. And I said, yes, that's the one I'm talking about. He said, so that's what we're doing it under. And I said, okay, I understand, but it's totally unconstitutional, and I don't have the slightest intention of obeying it. And he said, and I said, so are we all done here? And he said, yes, we're done. So I packed up and walked out of the courtroom and got in the cab and went to the airport and flew home. So I come into the office the next morning, and I pick up the telephone and I call Russell Hemingway. Russell Hemingway is an old friend of mine. He's actually a friend of John Kennedy's, who was in the Navy with him. A very wealthy, aristocratic guy from New York, and he runs a thing called the Fund for an Effective Congress that gives funding to Congress people. And I happen to know him because he was the preceding president and chair of the Fund for Constitutional Government, which I ended up chairing right after him in Washington. And so I called him up and told him what had happened. He said, look, you got to go on over and see Tip ONeill. He said, Tip will want to know about this. Get a couple of copies of the complaint and go on over and see him. I'll call him right now, and he'll be expecting you. So I go on down the street about 13 blocks from our little cubby hole we had. We had an old cobbler shop that was given to us to be our little law firm on Capitol Hill. So I go there, and I walk in, and here's Tip ONeill with his chief of staff, sitting there in a wheelchair. And so I showed him a copy of the complaint, and he starts reading through it. And he starts looking through this, and he says, oh my God, he said, if what you're saying here is true, well, this is potentially impeachable offenses. And I said, my point exactly. And he said, look, he said, you got to understand that, and this is now June 2nd of 1986. And he says, at the present time, he said, we're only in charge of the House of Representatives, and the Republicans run the Senate. He said, and so that even if, Peter Rodino and the guys in the Judiciary Committee to return articles of impeachment against him, against Reagan and Bush and the others, Meese and the others in here, he said, the Senate will never convict them. And so we have to really wait until see if we're going to take control here in the fall of '86 of the Senate. But here's what you want to do. You want to go on over and see Claiborne Pell. Claiborne Pell from Rhode Island is the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I'll call him and tell him you're coming over. Bring a copy of the complaint to him. And what you do is you want to ask him that if we take over the Senate in the fall, whether he will agree to set up a special select committee to investigate these charges that you've made here. And so I did. So I go on over to the Senate side, and go over to the Hart office building. I go to Claiborne Pell's office. He reads through the whole thing. And Tip ONeill said to me, look, he's going to ask, if he were to set up a special select committee, I said, who would you like to have head that up? And he said, and what you should do is you should tell him, John Kerry. Tell him John Kerry. He loves John Kerry. He said, he loves John Kerry so much we kid him that John Kerry must be his illegitimate son. He said, he thinks John Kerry is going to be president of the United States. And I said, well, that's funny. So does John. And we laughed. And he said, I said, well, look, go see Tip, or go see Claiborne. So I went over, and he agreed to do it. So I come back to my office. I come back up the street to the office. I walk in, and Patty Austin, my secretary from ACLU, when I ran the 10 states out there, or did the litigation for the 10 states. She says, Danny, there's an older gentleman waiting for you here. And I said, well, who is it? She said, I don't know. He didn't tell me who he was. I said, well, where is he? He's up in your office. And he's sitting there waiting for you. So I go upstairs. I walk in, and here's this guy, like 70-year-old guy, sitting there in the chair, and he's like in mufti. He's got these big khaki pants on with the big baggy pockets and stuff, and he's got this like fishing vest on with like 300 pockets in it. And so he's got this little hemp knapsack bag on his side. So I walk in, and I stuck my hand, and I said, hi, I'm Danny Sheehan. He said, yes, I know Mr. Sheehan. It's really nice to meet you. And he didn't tell me who he was. And so I go around, I sit behind my desk, and I say, oh, so look, what can I do to help you? He said, well, look, and he reaches in his little bag, he said, I got a copy of your complaint here that you filed last Friday, and I just want to ask you a couple questions about it. You don't have to answer me, he said, but if you do, I might be able to help you out here. And so I said, okay, what is it? He said, well, of the 26 defendants you have here, who do you think is the most important of all of these? And I said, oh, that's easy. It's Theodore Shaklee. And he said, Oh, really? He said, and why is that? I said, well, a lot of people would think it's because Theodore Shaklee was the ADDO. He was the Associate Deputy Director for Operations under George Bush when he was the DCI, right? And now he's Vice President, and his National Security Advisor is Donald P. Gregg, who was the CIA case officer for Felix Rodriguez and for Rafael Chichi Quintero, who run the airlift operation. So I said, a lot of people would think that would be the most important reason why he's the most important. He looked at me and said, but that's not the main reason why you think he's the most important. I said, no. He said, well, what is? I said, he was the CIA station chief in Miami on November 22nd of 1963. He said, my God, he said that there's not 5 men in the world that would have answered the question that way. He said, and he gets up and comes across the room and sticks his hand out and says, my name is Dick Billings. I was the chief of staff of the House Select Committee on Assassinations. And I think we can help each other out here. He said, there's a guy who wants to meet you right away. I can't tell you who he is right now, but would you be willing to meet him? And I said, sure. And he said, he said, when? I said, like tomorrow. And we set up a lunch for tomorrow. So he said, where do you want to meet him? I want you to be comfortable wherever you're meeting him. And I said, I felt like Michael Corleone, like I've got to go meet him at Louis where we're all going to be comfortable. And so I said, well, let's meet at the Dubliner Cafe. It's right at the bottom of the hill here. So noontime. So I go over there the next day at noontime, and I walk up, and there's Dick Billings out front, and I shake his hand. We walk in. Here's this older guy, another guy like 70 years old or so, sitting at the table all alone. We walk in and sit down, and we walk over, and Dick Billings says, Danny Sheehan, Joe Smith. Joe Smith, Dan Sheehan. I go, Joe Smith, right. And he says, no, look, I get that all the time. He says, my name is Joseph Burkholder Smith. I said, I was the deputy CIA station chief in Mexico City back in 1973 when Theodore Shaklee came on as the director of Western Hemisphere operations. And I said, okay, now we're getting somewhere. So we sit down. He tells me the story. He said, when Shaklee got taken out as the CIA station chief in Saigon back in 73, and brought back home and became the director of Western Hemisphere operations, he removed all the station chiefs for every one of the stations all through the Western Hemisphere and put in his own men, arguing that Phil Agee, a CIA guy, was writing a book called Inside the Company, and he might have known the names of the station chiefs. It was going to compromise them. So he put all of his own guys, he said, and he replaced our guy here in Mexico City with a guy named Tom Polgar. Polgar comes into my office first day he was there, and he said, Joe, I don't know if I'm going to be able to keep you on here as the deputy. There's going to be a guy coming in here tomorrow morning about 10 o'clock. You'll recognize him. And he's going to ask you some questions. And he may have some other people that want to ask you some questions. You don't have to answer any of them, but it'll depend on whether you're going to be left on as my deputy. So he said the next morning, so I'm sitting here at the table with him with Dick Billings right over here, and here's Joseph Burkholder Smith. He's telling me the story at the Dubliner Cafe. And he says, the next day into my office walks Nasser Haro, who is the head of the DFS in Mexico, which is like the FBI and the CIA all combined together. And he comes in, he said, Joe, I imagine Polgar told you I was going to come see you. And I said, I didn't know it was going to be you. He didn't tell me who it was going to be, but he said I'd recognize you, and I do. And the guy says, look, there's some people who'd like to ask you some questions. And it'll control whether you're going to be left on here as a deputy. And so, would you come with me and we'll see them? He said, yeah. So they leave, and he said they go down, they get in this little Suburban with smoke-filled windows and drive to the airport and go around security and get in a Learjet. And we fly away, and we fly, and we end up going to Buenos Aires, Argentina. And we land in Buenos Aires, we get out, we go around the security, I get in this helicopter, and we fly all the way to the northwesternmost corner of Argentina, where these 5 different countries all come together up there in South America. And we land on this, looked like a soccer field, he said. And I get out from the helicopter, and I follow Nasser Haro across the soccer field and up this big embankment. And I look over the embankment, and I thought I was in Bavaria. He said, I look down, he brings me down to this little town. We walk into this like Bavarian inn, and here are these 6 guys all sitting at this big mahogany or big oaken table, he says, and they got a big stone fireplace behind them, and up on the mantelpiece is a swastika flag. And the guy gestures for me to sit down in the one seat on the other side of the table, so I sit down, and the guy says to me, Joe? I said, look, it's not clear you're going to be left on here as the deputy for the CIA station in Mexico City, but we put in an awful lot of time building a new major cocaine cartel down in Medellin, down in Colombia, and we're going to be moving cocaine up into the United States, and a portion of the profits are going to be used to help fund our war without boundaries against your enemies and ours. And we just wanted to make sure that if you're going to be left on as a deputy, that you're not going to do anything to interfere with that. And Joseph Burkholder Smith says to me, and Dan, he said, I swear to God, I don't know what I'd ever done in my life that would have led them to believe I would do something like that, go along with them on that. And I said to him, well, how about being the deputy CIA station chief in Mexico City for a start? And he says, he turns to Billy and said, I thought this guy was going to cooperate with us. And Billy said, look, I just met the guy. He said, he gets up and walks around the table, sticks his hand out to me, and grabs my hand, looks me in the eye, and he said, I just wanted to make sure that if you're going to be dealing with Shaklee and these guys, you know really who you're dealing with. Okay? So that's who you're dealing with. That's who you're still dealing with. You got to understand that there is an international fascist alliance that still exists, that was functioning all during World War II with the Third Reich. Still, it was functioning before that the Third Reich was actually funded and put into place through a thing called the Union Bank of New York that was actually set up by the Brown Brothers Harriman private investment firm, the CEO of whom was George Herbert Walker, who was the grandfather of George Herbert Walker Bush. And the counsel for the Brown Brothers Harriman was Allen Dulles, who was the first civilian head of the Central Intelligence Agency at the end of World War II. That George Herbert Walker stepped out in 1924 as the CEO and set up the Union Bank of New York. And they capitalized that bank with the funders of the Brown Brothers Harriman private investment firm. And they set up a foreign subsidiary in the Netherlands called the Bank of Commerce and Shipping and Commerce. And they funded the construction of the entire international headquarters of the Third Reich and funded the rise of the Third Reich in Germany to be the bulwark against Bolshevism in Europe. Okay? And so you need to understand what you're dealing with here. That this is a profound, dangerous operation that's going on in the world. And at the end of World War II, they set up, not only with Reinhard Gehlen being the head of the West German intelligence as the primary source of intelligence for the United States against the Soviet Union, but they set up a thing in Bavaria called the Anti-Communist Special Warfare Training Academy, where they trained from 1947 to 1965, 1,200 men under the command of Otto Skorzeny. Major General Otto Skorzeny of the Third Reich was in fact the commandant of the special forces of the SS. And they trained these 1,200 men in special anti-communist warfare tactics, of all kinds of duplicity, deception, blackmailing, everything that they were engaged in. And it wasn't to engage in anti-communism. It was pro-fascist, which is the alliance between private corporations and the state. And so that the state actually puts at the disposal of the benefit of the private corporations the instrumentalities of the state, including the taxing structure, so that they tax everybody and then they subsidize the research and development for the major corporations. They enter into contracts with the major military operations to provide the military equipment for projecting military power around the world, to get access to the natural resources of the other countries in order to provide the resources for the major corporations. Okay? And that's what's going on here. And now it's right in your face. I mean, it's right straight in your face now with Trump. He's such a reductionist fool. He doesn't even know how to be subtle about it. You know, he says that, you know, we have now become the #1 exporter of oil for the whole world, right in the face of 193 countries meeting in Paris in December of 2015 to stop global climate change. He's bragging about now we're the #1 exporter of oil. He means not us. He means the corporations. There's not a single drop of that stuff is going to anywhere in the United States. It's being dragged right down through the central United States, through the Dakota Access Pipeline, Keystone XL tar sands pipeline, all the way down to the Gulf Coast, refined and shipped out across the world. Okay? So they can maintain their 800 military bases around the world for the projection of U.S. military power into the rest of the world. They invaded the Middle Eastern oil fields. The minute that Gorbachev stepped back from the Cold War and released all the republics, they moved right in and invaded the Middle Eastern oil fields and occupied them under a complete bullshit excuse of theoretically that Saddam Hussein was theoretically going to go and invade Saudi Arabia. You know, I mean, it's a whole long story. But the fact of the matter is, you need to understand what's really going on in the world. You know, that lawyers are necessary to understand what's happening in the world. Lawyers are necessary to take these people on. You have the advantage of being trained advocates and trained adversaries of bad guys. These are the bad guys, you know, and so you need to understand that, and you need to decide whether or not you're going to take them on. One of the challenges is that the ACLU will not take them on. The ACLU are complete chicken shit. And I can tell you that because I ran the cases for them for 10 states. You know, they wouldn't defend anybody who was brought up in front of the McCarthy Committee, who they thought was really a socialist. Wouldn't represent them. Wouldn't represent anybody who was the Japanese Americans that were taken into custody and interned. Wouldn't represent them because it was too unpopular. You know, will not in fact challenge the basic theme of state capitalism. You know, of garnering all the resources for the corporations. They won't do it. Okay? So, which doesn't make them the worst people in the whole world. But all I'm saying is that you aren't going to be able to get them. Don't rely upon going to work for them and try to take on these bad guys. You're going to have to do that yourself. Okay? So, that's the short answer to your question. With another story. Okay? But anyway, so there's bad guys out there, and you guys should start getting ready to deal with them. You know, and you have to figure out how to do it, where to go and do it from. You know, I made the mistake of trying to talk the #1 corporate law firm in the world to doing it. I should have known better, but I didn't know really who they were at that time. You know, I just thought that, you know, some people made mistakes, you know, or didn't know what they were doing, but they do know what they're doing. Okay. So there's
some people have class.
Yeah, everybody has class. Okay. So anyway, thank you for coming. Just wanted to get you kind of focused on what you got coming, and let you know that there are people here who will work with you.
I actually do have one relevant question to that.
Yeah.
You said that we have to know what we want if this is the kind of work we want to be pursuing.
Yes.
I guess in that line, what was the moment you decided you wanted to do this, and what was the hardest thing to deal with about this line of work since you started?
Well, I was lucky that, you know, I was born, you know, in 45. I was going to law school right during all the major civil rights demonstrations. You know, Martin Luther King, you know, was active. You know, Bobby Kennedy. I was working in Bobby Kennedy's campaign in '68 when he was assassinated in June. You know, that the entire atmosphere at that time was in opposition to the war in Vietnam. I spent 2 years in ROTC being trained in special forces. Didn't take a genius to figure out what they were up to. So I just refused to do it and left. You know, so I realized what they were doing. I wasn't going to spend my time fighting with them about it, but I went to law school. And when I was asked to write for the Harvard Civil Rights, or for the Harvard Law Review, they said my first article that they were asked to do was to write an article on how to set up a foreign subsidiary for an American corporation. And I said, I don't give a shit about setting up a foreign subsidiary for an American corporation. What do I care about that? And they said, well, if you're going to write for the law review, you have to be doing things like that. I said, no, I want to do civil rights stuff and human rights stuff. He said, well, once in a while there's a case that comes up in the Supreme Court and we'll write a note on it, but we don't spend a lot of time doing that. You'd have to set up your own law review or something. So we did. So that's what we did. Mark Green and I, who went on to become the ombudsman for the city of New York, he and I created the Harvard Civil Rights Law Review. And that's how it began. And I sent out a whole bunch of letters and things across the country to lawyers saying, look, if you've got a really important constitutional issue, then please send it to us. And we'll get all these little eager beavers here at Harvard Law School, and we'll work away at it and help you on the case. And so I started getting inundated with requests from around the country, and that's how I got to know all the people. And so we began, that's how we started the case that established the right of journalists to protect their confidential news sources. I got contacted by actually the Black Panthers out in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and there was an NBC television reporter that had interviewed them, and the grand jury tried to subpoena him and find out what they had said to him. So we came up with this idea. I actually came up with the idea of asserting a First Amendment right to protect their confidential news sources. And it went all the way to the United States Supreme Court when I was in my second year of law school. And that's why I got recruited by the big law firm that represents NBC News to come down, because the other guy wouldn't let them represent him. They insisted that we do it because we knew what we were talking about. So that's how I ended up doing it. And it was just part of the time, part of the age, just like you guys are in. You guys are coming out into a world that will help define, what the human rights issues and civil rights issues, constitutional issues are. I mean, holy mackerel. I mean, to watch the news on any given night is just a deluge of constitutional issues. They're just flying in every direction. I mean, William Barr, in intervening into an individual prosecution of a case, the president telling him what to do in the individual cases. I mean, they just abound. So that you guys are going to, people who are progressive and interested in constitutional rights are walking into an atmosphere where it's the times that are going to affect why you do the thing. And the question as to what was the largest challenge to doing it was coming to the realization that you had to set the thing up yourself, that you couldn't really just go somewhere and walk into some institution that's going to be doing this kind of thing. Now we happen to have the Romero Institute that we've got set up now in Santa Cruz, and so we work at that. We get grants from people and contributions and stuff. We have a 501c3 and can do that, but you can do the same kind of thing. You can set one up yourself, and we can show you how to do it.
I guess in that vein, then, to specify the question a little more, what's the hardest litigation you've lost, and how did you deal with that?
The only one we've ever lost is the Iran-Contra case, when the judge stopped it from going to a jury. The judge, it's a long and complicated, the judge excluded the three key witnesses, eyewitnesses that we had, connecting the guy who blew up a major press conference down in Costa Rica and killed 6 of the journalists there. And we connected him directly to the enterprise that was supplying the C4 and the equipment that had been used to do the bombing. And so we had an ABC television cameraman who was injured during the thing. And so he had standing under the Federal Criminal Racketeering Act, the Federal Criminal Influenced Racketeering case, RICO, the Racketeer Influence and Corrupt Organization Act, has a civil corollary. There's a criminal statute and the civil corollary, but it only protects people who have had their business interests injured, which shouldn't surprise you from the Congress. But but that's so we ended up figuring out how to have standing on that, and we got all the way to the eve of the trial, and the judge stepped in and struck down the 3 witnesses who had identified this guy being directly connected with John Hall, whose ranch is where they were flying in the weapons and stuff. And they said that because the witnesses had seen this man there with John Hall 22 days before the bombing. And on one of the witnesses saw him actually, the 2 of them together, at the site of the bombing 22 days earlier. And he said it would confuse the jury. They might think he was there on the day of the bombing and you only have him there 22 days prior to the bombing. And so I'm going to exclude those 3 witnesses. And once I exclude those 3 witnesses, you don't have any nexus between the actual bombing that injured your ABC television cameraman and the enterprise. Transparently bogus, just as stupid as the arguments the Republican Party are making about first saying you don't have anybody who has direct eyewitness of what the president said. And by the way, the 5 people who do have direct eyewitness testimony, we're not going to allow them to testify. Excuse me. So there has to be rationality still in the world. And the most important thing is not to despair. Not to despair in the face of this just absolute disregard for truth, absolute disregard for law, that you can't become despairing and figure out, they're all both crazy, Democrats are as bad as Republicans, that despairing. You can't do that. So that's the only one that we've ever lost in 50 years. And everybody knows that what we said was true. Everybody knows that the Reagan-Bush administration were involved in all of that. And now people are actually doing podcasts and everything else saying how terrible it was. And what a precedent has been established now with William Barr, directing the president to pardon the principal witnesses against him. And here he is again. So that, all that stuff's going to come out. There's the old saying that Abraham Lincoln said, you can fool some of the people all the time, and you can fool all the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. These are the people you can fool all the time. Those are the ones. There's like 20% of the people in the country that, you can tell them black is white, up is down, and they don't have any kind of discriminatory tendency. They can't discriminate the truth from fiction. And they don't spend time reading, they don't spend time studying, and most of the time it's not their fault. They're in a for shit education system, who doesn't really teach them critical thinking, doesn't train them to challenge authority, doesn't train them to understand the Constitution of the United States. They don't understand anything. And so we have to have a major grassroots public education campaign to help people understand things like this. We can't just demonize them, but the fact is they're manipulating those people. And so so we ran into that problem in the Iran-Contra case. He just entered a summary judgment, the same thing he threatened to do the first time I ever talked to him. I'm going to enter a summary judgment against your case if you're not here by 2:00. He was amazed I showed up, but he ended up entering a Rule 56 order of summary judgment, and then told us that if we appealed it, that he would done us the entire legal fees for the other side, which he did, because we did appeal it. We went to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, your reference to the 11th Circuit, and we had a 3-judge panel. And a week before the oral argument in front of the 3-judge panel, Judge Vance, who was the chief judge on it, got murdered. Someone delivered a letter bomb to his house and blew him all up on his front porch and killed him. And George Bush Sr. replaced him with an appointment of a guy by the name of Stanley Birch Jr., who was the patent lawyer for the Cabbage Patch Dolls. Who had never been a judge a day in his life, was a major contributor to George Bush's campaign, appointed him right onto the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, and they put him right on the chair of our panel. And he just started raging at us the minute we showed up for the hearing. It's completely ridiculous. You filed this lawsuit. You should have known that we're never going to be able to win this. The Justice Department had already made a decision they weren't going to prosecute these people for whatever reason they chose, they said. And so that you went ahead and tried to prosecute them basically for criminal charges. Didn't have the slightest understanding of what the Federal Criminal Racketeering Act was all about, the civil provisions. The guy was a complete ignoramus, and there he is on the federal bench. You're going to run into a lot of those people. You're going to run into a lot of those people. They just thinks the Constitution is a ship that sits in the harbor in Boston. Really just complete ignoramuses. And you're going to have to deal with that. And so we were just, thunderstruck by this guy. And he just went off on us. And so that was the one that we didn't win. But other than that, in 50 years, it's the only case that we've not won, which is more a selection issue. If you sit in an office and whoever comes through the door, as long as they can pay you, you're going to represent them. You'll win some, lose some, But, if you're selective, you just do the cases that are right. And then you'll not only have a good track record, but you'll be a lot happier in your practice. So there you go. Okay? And there are other stories that, but we got 50 years of them, you know. So we'll tell you some of the other stories then. And, you know, I'll try to, in the context of the course, you know, help you figure out how to actually set up a practice, how you do it, and how you go about getting the cases, how you get the clients, how you raise the funds, you know, how you set up the staff that you want to have, what the kind of different skill sets are that you need to have of people to help you. You know, and be able to recognize your strengths and some of your weaknesses and get the staff who can fill in your weaknesses. You know, I have a couple. But I have a big staff, so it isn't as obvious. Okay? So thank you for coming, you guys. Yeah.